There is a moment, centuries after his death, when merely saying his name could still empty a marketplace. Cities that had stood for 1,000 years would surrender the instant they heard he was coming, because the alternative was annihilation. Sultans fled before him, abandoning capitals they had ruled for generations. Emperors who had never bowed to any foreign power quietly began paying him tribute. In the folk memory of half the world, he became less a man than a force of nature, a punishment sent down from the sky itself, an unstoppable weather system with a face. His own people called him Genghis Khan, the oceanic ruler, the ruler of all, a name meant to suggest authority as vast and boundless as the sea. Even now, nearly 1,000 years later, geneticists studying the Y chromosome lineages of men across Central Asia have identified a pattern so widespread that they believe his bloodline may run through tens of millions of people alive today, an inheritance quietly carried, without most of them ever knowing it, in the DNA of a staggering fraction of the human species. But that is not where this story begins. This story begins with a boy who had nothing. A boy who watched his father die of poison at the hands of men who had, only hours earlier, called him a welcome guest at their fire. A boy whose own clan, the very men his family had led, fed, and protected for years, looked at a young widow and her children and decided, coldly and without ceremony, that they were no longer worth following, and simply rode away into the grass, taking the herds with them. A boy who grew up hungry on the coldest, most punishing grassland on earth, eating wild onions and roots and fish that his own people considered food fit only for the desperate, because there was nothing else left to eat. A boy who was hunted down by men who feared what he might one day become, captured, and locked into a wooden collar before he had even reached manhood. Before he was the man that conquerors, generals, and historians would study for the next 800 years, before he was the man who would build the largest contiguous land empire the world has ever known, larger than the empires of Rome and Alexander combined. Temujin was simply a child trying to survive the next winter, with no certainty that he would. How does a boy like that end up uniting an entire people who had spent generations trying to destroy one another? How does an abandoned, half-starved child, with no wealth, no army, and no guaranteed protector, become the founder of an empire that would eventually stretch from the shores of the Pacific to the edges of Europe? That is the question this story is going to answer, slowly, the way it actually happened, not as a list of dates and battles, but as the story of a life, shaped one loss and one hard-won victory at a time. And if you enjoy stories like this, consider subscribing. It's completely free for you, and it genuinely helps motivate me to keep making documentaries like this one. Now let's go back to the beginning, back before the empire, back before the title of Khan, back to a world that very few people today would recognize. To understand Temujin, you first have to understand the world that made him, because almost nothing about his childhood makes sense without it. The Mongolian steppe is one of the least forgiving landscapes on the planet. It is a vast, rolling sea of grassland stretching further than the eye can comprehend in any direction, bordered by punishing deserts to the south and dense forests to the north, and it is a place of savage extremes. Summers can be blisteringly hot, the sun beating down on open plains with almost no shade for hundreds of miles. Winters, by contrast, can plunge to temperatures that kill livestock by the thousands in a single bad season, and can freeze an unprepared human being to death within hours. There were no cities in the sense that settled civilizations understood them, few reliable crops, and almost no permanent shelter. Survival on the steppe depended entirely on movement, on following the seasons, the grass, and the water, driving herds of horses, sheep, goats, camels, and cattle from pasture to pasture in a cycle of migration that never really stopped, year after year, generation after generation. In this world, the horse was not simply a means of transportation. It was survival itself, woven into every part of daily life. Mongol children were put on horseback almost as soon as they could walk, sometimes before they could reliably speak in full sentences, learning to ride before they had fully learned to run. A Mongol without a horse was, in a very real sense, a person without legs, without a livelihood, and without a future. Horses provided meat when times were desperate, milk that could be fermented into a mildly alcoholic staple drink, leather for clothing and equipment, and above all, mobility, The ability to outrun disaster, to strike an enemy camp at dawn and vanish before anyone could organize a response, to move an entire household of people and animals across hundreds of miles in a matter of days in search of grass that had not yet been eaten by a rival's herds. Everything about Mongol life, from war to marriage to trade to simple survival, was built around what a horse could do, and a boy's skill on horseback was often the first real measure taken of his worth. But the steppe was not simply harsh in a physical sense. It was harsh politically, in ways that would prove just as dangerous to Temujin as any winter storm. Mongolia in the 12th century was not a unified country in any sense a modern viewer would recognize. It was a shifting, uneasy patchwork of clans and tribal confederations. Mongols, Tatars, Merkits, Karaits, Naimans, and smaller groups besides, bound together loosely by blood, by marriage, and by temporary convenience, and just as often torn apart by feuds that could smolder for generations before erupting again. Alliances were rarely permanent. A tribe that rode beside you one summer, sharing pasture and hunting grounds, might raid your herds and burn your camp the next. Loyalty existed on the steppe, and it could be genuinely powerful when it held, but it was fragile, constantly renegotiated, constantly tested by hunger, ambition, insult, and old grudges that never fully died and were passed down, sometimes, from father to son like an inheritance of grievance. This meant that political power on the steppe was desperately unstable, built on foundations that could shift in a single season. A chief's authority rested almost entirely on his ability to provide, in very practical terms, protection from raiders, access to good pasture, victories in battle that brought plunder and prestige to the families who followed him. The moment a leader could no longer provide these things, whether through death, defeat, or simple bad luck, his followers had little binding obligation to remain at his side. There was no deep institutional loyalty holding a tribe together the way a kingdom might be held together by written law, organized religion, or centuries of settled tradition and inherited land. There was only the constant, practical calculation of survival, made fresh by every family, every season. Is this leader still worth following, or would we be safer, better fed, and better protected somewhere else? It is essential to understand this, because it explains something that might otherwise seem shocking to a modern audience, that a child born into a position of relative privilege and comfort could, almost overnight, lose everything the instant his father was no longer there to hold it together. This was not going to be a distant, hypothetical danger for the boy born in the 1160s to a minor Mongol chieftain named Yasujii. It was going to become the defining fact of his entire childhood, arriving faster and more brutally than anyone in his family could have prepared for. Yasujii was a member of the Borjigin clan, a lineage of some genuine standing among the Mongols, and he held a modest but real degree of power as a chief leading several allied families and their herds. He was a capable and respected warrior, his reputation built through raids and feuds fought across the surrounding steppe, and among his most notable and dangerous rivalries was one with the Tatars, a rival tribal confederation to the east whose enmity would, in one form or another, shadow his son's entire life, resurfacing again and again at crucial moments. According to tradition preserved in the secret history of the Mongols, the earliest surviving Mongol chronicle, and by far our richest source for Temujin's early life, though one that blends genuine historical memory with legend, poetic embellishment, and later political framing meant to glorify its subject. Yasujii had just returned from a successful raid against the Tatars when his wife, Holon, gave birth to their first son. The story handed down through generations says the infant was born gripping a clot of blood tightly in his small fist, an image that later Mongol tradition treated as an omen of the violent, world-shaking life that lay ahead of him. It is impossible to verify a detail like this as literal historical fact, and it should be understood the way it was almost certainly understood by the generations who first told it, not as clinical biography, but as the kind of origin story a people tells about a man who has already become legendary in their own lifetime, reading meaning backward into his birth once his greatness was no longer in doubt. What can be said with somewhat more confidence is that Yasujii named his newborn son Temujin, likely in honor of, or perhaps in mockery of, a defeated Tatar chief he had just captured or killed in that same raid, away. of claiming the enemy's strength as a kind of trophy, folded permanently into the very identity of his own son. Temujin's mother, Holon, deserves far more attention in this story than she often receives in shorter tellings, because without her, there would very simply be no Genghis Khan at all. Holon had not originally been intended for Yasujii. She had already been married to a man from the Merkit tribe, and Yasujii, riding together with his brothers, ambushed her wedding party on the open steppe and abducted her, carrying her off to become his own wife. By modern standards, this is, without question, a brutal and violent act, and it should not be softened or romanticized. But it reflected the norms of steppe political and social life at the time, where marriage was frequently entangled with raiding, alliance building, revenge, and outright seizure, and where a woman's fate could be decided in an afternoon by men she had never met. Whatever the brutal circumstances of how she came into Yasujii's household, Holon would prove, in the years ahead, to be one of the most formidable and consequential figures in her son's entire life. Intelligent, fiercely protective, politically shrewd, and, as events would very soon prove, almost supernaturally resilient in the face of catastrophe. She was not a background character standing quietly behind her famous son. She was, in very real and practical terms, the first person who ever taught Temujin that survival remained possible even after everything had been taken from you. In these earliest years, before disaster struck, Temujin's life looked, on the surface at least, reasonably secure, even comfortable by the standards of the steppe. He had brothers close to him in age, Khazar, Kakian, and Temuj, and a younger sister, Temulin, along with two half-brothers, Bektar and Belgudii, born to Yasujii by a second wife, a common arrangement in a polygamous society organized around herding and alliance. He was being raised within a family that, while far from being among the most powerful on the steppe, held real and recognized status, the kind of standing that came with obligations, respect, and expectations. His father had genuine ambitions for him, and those ambitions followed the customs of the time closely, securing a good marriage alliance for his eldest son while Temujin was still young enough for the match to be arranged with care. When Temujin was around 9 years old, Yasujii took him on a long journey toward the territory of Holon's own people, hoping to find a suitable bride for his son among a related and friendly clan. Along the way, father and son encountered a chief named Day Sechin, of the Ongjarat tribe, who had a young daughter close to Temujin's own age, a girl named Borte. Day Sechin, reading favorable signs in a dream he claimed to have had the night before their meeting, proposed a match between the two children on the spot. Yasujii, pleased with what he saw of the girl and her family, agreed. Following steppe custom, he left Temujin behind with Borte's family for a period of time, a practice meant to let the boy grow familiar with his future in-laws, learn their household, and prove himself useful, respectful, and capable in their eyes before the marriage was eventually formalized. It was, in its own quiet way, a moment of genuine promise, the first clear sign that Temujin's future had been thoughtfully mapped out for him by a father who cared what became of him, that he would grow up, marry well into a respected family, and take his own place as an established and respected member of Mongol society, following in his father's footsteps. Then, on the long journey home alone, without his son beside him, everything Temujin had was suddenly and irreversibly taken from him. According to the secret history, Yasujii, traveling back without Temujin, stopped along the way among a group of Tatars to share a meal, as steppe custom of hospitality demanded even toward men who might, under other circumstances, be considered old enemies. The Tatars recognized him, perhaps recalling old grievances from his earlier raids against their people, and secretly poisoned his food while pretending to offer him nothing but welcome. Yasujii made it most of the way home before the poison took full effect, growing violently and rapidly ill on the road, and by the time he finally reached his family's camp, he understood that he was dying and that there was no remedy available to save him. His final urgent act, according to tradition, was to send a trusted man to retrieve Temujin, so that his eldest son could return home and see his father one final time before death took him, an act that reveals, even filtered through legend, the desperate urgency of a dying man trying to secure whatever future he still could for his family in the very last hours available to him. Temujin returned to find his father already dead or dying beyond any hope of recovery. And with Yasujii died something far larger and more consequential than the life of one man. Yasujii's authority, his hard-earned ability to command loyalty, to guarantee protection, and to hold together the network of families and herders who depended on him, died with him, instantly and completely. And on the steppe, as we have already seen, that kind of authority was never automatically inherited by a son, however promising he might be. It had to be actively built and continuously defended, and a child, however intelligent or determined, simply could not do that. What happened next is one of the most quietly devastating episodes in Temujin's entire early life, precisely because it involves no dramatic violence at all, only cold, calculated abandonment. The followers who had once depended on Yasujii, the families who had camped alongside him for years, hunted with him, fought beside him in raids, and shared in the plunder and protection his leadership provided, made a hard, practical decision, the kind of decision the harsh logic of the steppe demanded of them. A widow and a handful of young children could not lead raids, could not guarantee good pasture in a contested season, could not promise victory or protection against rival clans. So, in one of the harshest and most unsentimental customs of this unforgiving political world, they simply left. They packed their households, loaded their belongings onto carts and horses, gathered up the herds that had once been Yasujii's, and rode away across the grass, leaving Holon and her children behind with almost nothing to their name. This is the question worth sitting with for a moment, because it represents the true, painful beginning of Temujin's actual story, the moment everything else grows out of. What happens to a child when the very people who once depended entirely on his father decide, almost overnight and without a trace of ceremony, that his family is simply no longer worth following? The answer, in Temujin's particular case, was that he learned, earlier, more brutally, and more completely than most human beings ever have to. That power on the steppe was never truly inherited. It had to be built from nothing, over and over if necessary, and it could be lost entirely in the space of a single terrible afternoon. What followed was not a brief or temporary hardship that resolved itself within a season. It was years of genuine, grinding desperation. Holon, left with young children and virtually no herd left to sustain them, refused to let her family simply perish out on the open grassland. The secret history describes her riding out alone with a makeshift banner raised high, trying, largely in vain, to rally at least some portion of the departed followers back to her side, appealing to whatever loyalty and obligation might still remain. When that effort failed, as it mostly did, she turned to the only resource that remained fully available to her, the land itself, unforgiving as it was. She and her children foraged wherever and however they could, gathering wild onions, garlic, and edible roots from the ground, fishing in nearby rivers and streams, hunting small game like marmots wherever it could be caught, food that, under the family's former circumstances of relative status, would have been considered beneath them, fit only for the very poorest and most desperate households on the steppe. There was no guarantee, on any given day, of a real meal. There was no guarantee that the family would survive the next winter at all. What there was, unwaveringly, was a mother absolutely determined that her children would not die out there on the open grass, and a boy watching, day after day, learning in the most visceral way imaginable that the world would not simply hand him what he needed to live. He would have to take it, earn it, scavenge for it, or find some other way entirely, a lesson that would never leave him. This period of hunger and isolation shaped Temujin in ways that would echo throughout the rest of his life, resurfacing again and again in how he later treated allies, enemies, and the followers who chose to stay loyal to him. It taught him, in the most direct and physical way possible, that status could evaporate almost instantly, that hunger did not care in the slightest about a person's bloodline or former rank, and that the people who abandon you in your weakest, most vulnerable moment reveal something fundamentally true about how loyalty actually functions on the steppe, that it is not a fixed gift owed by birthright, but a constantly renegotiated transaction, tested and retested by circumstance. Later in his life, Temujin would become famous, and in some quarters infamous, for rewarding genuine loyalty with extraordinary and lasting generosity, while punishing betrayal without the slightest mercy or hesitation. It is not remotely hard to see, looking back at these desperate childhood years, exactly where that deep and unshakable instinct was first forged. It was during this same desperate period, with hunger a constant companion and status nothing but a fading memory, that one of the darkest and most morally complicated episodes of Temujin's entire childhood occurred: the killing of his own half-brother, Bektar. The tensions that led to this tragedy were not simple, and they should not be flattened into an easy story of good versus evil within the family. According to the secret history, real hostility had been building for some time between the full brothers, Temujin and Khazar, and their half-brothers, particularly Bektar, who was somewhat older and who, by some accounts, had increasingly begun asserting a kind of dominance over the family's meager and precious resources, behaving as though his relative seniority within the fractured household entitled him to more than his fair share of what little food the family managed to gather. Tensions reportedly boiled over on more than one occasion, notably in disputes over hunted birds and fish that Bektar allegedly claimed for himself, taking food directly out of the mouths of his younger siblings. What might, in a wealthier and more stable household, have remained nothing more than an ordinary sibling rivalry became, in a family living permanently on the very edge of starvation, something far more dangerous and far more consequential. The story that has come down to us through the secret history is a genuinely difficult one to sit with, and it does not flatter its central subject. Temujin and Khazar, angered by what they saw as Bektar's repeated selfishness and his implicit, growing challenge to their standing within what remained of the family, stalked him and killed him in what appears to have been a deliberate ambush, carried out by boys who were still, by any reasonable modern standard, children themselves, not yet fully grown. Holon, upon learning what her sons had done, is described in the chronicle as reacting with genuine fury and grief, reportedly comparing them in her anger to savage animals turning viciously on their own kin, a rebuke aimed squarely at the fact that they had just destroyed what little family unity remained, at a moment when unity was the family's only real defense against a hostile world. It would be a serious mistake and dishonest to the sources themselves to sand down the edges of this episode simply to make Temujin a more comfortable, more conventionally heroic figure for a modern audience. It is a genuinely disturbing act, and the sources themselves preserve it as disturbing rather than heroic. This was not later erased, edited out, or softened by subsequent Mongol tradition, which strongly suggests it was remembered honestly as a real and troubling turning point, rather than invented or embellished later as a flattering legend. What it reveals about the young Temujin is genuinely complicated, resisting any easy moral simplification. It shows a boy who was already willing to use lethal, premeditated violence to eliminate what he perceived as a serious threat to his position and to his family's fragile survival, even when that threat came from within his own household, from his own blood. It also reveals, in a darker and more unsettling sense, an early instance of a trait that would come to define his entire adult life: a deep and abiding intolerance for anyone at all, even close relatives, who he believed threatened the order, unity, and authority he was fighting so desperately to hold together. Temujin was not being introduced to history, at this early stage, as a flawless or destined hero. He was being introduced as a complicated, damaged human being growing up in a genuinely brutal environment, capable already of both extraordinary loyalty toward those who stood with him and ruthless, decisive violence toward those he judged to be working against him, sometimes within the very same difficult year of his young life. If the killing of Bektar revealed just how far Temujin might be willing to go to protect his family's fragile position, what happened next revealed just how precarious that position truly remained, even after the violence within his own household. Word of the family's ongoing internal strife, or perhaps simply a renewed awareness of their continued weakness and isolation, eventually reached a rival clan known as the Taikid, who had once been loosely allied with Yasujii during his lifetime, but had since turned decisively against his family in the years following his death, fearing, or perhaps simply resenting, the possibility that this determined and evidently dangerous boy might one day grow into a genuine threat to their own position. The Taikid moved directly against Temujin. He was hunted down across the open steppe and, after a pursuit, captured. What followed was a period of genuine, humiliating captivity that Temujin was fitted. With a kang, a heavy wooden collar or yoke locked around his neck and wrists simultaneously, a restraining device specifically designed to humiliate as well as to physically control a prisoner, making it extraordinarily difficult to eat properly, to sleep in any comfort, or to defend himself in any way should the opportunity arise. He was paraded from one household of his captors to another in a kind of rotating custody, an arrangement apparently meant both to prevent any single family from bearing sole responsibility for guarding him and to publicly display his complete helplessness to the wider community. For a boy who had already lost his father, lost his family's followers, and lost any real guarantee of a stable and secure future, this period of captivity must have represented an almost unbearable low point, an experience of being utterly at the mercy of people who had every conceivable reason to want him permanently out of the way. But Temujin did not remain a prisoner for long. According to tradition, he waited and watched carefully for the right moment, and during a Teokid feast, when his guard's attention had visibly lapsed, likely dulled by the drinking and celebration common to such gatherings, he seized his opportunity. He struck one of his captors with the heavy kang still locked around his own neck, using the very device meant to control him as a weapon, and made a desperate, immediate escape into the darkness of the night. What followed was a tense and dangerous pursuit, with Temujin hiding, according to tradition, submerged nearly to his chin in a nearby river, keeping only his face above the waterline in the cold current, using both the darkness and the concealment of the water to stay hidden from searchers combing methodically along the riverbanks. Eventually, exhausted and still burdened by the kang, he found help from unexpected quarters, first from a sympathetic herdsman who discovered him, hid him from the search parties, and helped remove the heavy wooden collar, and then from a family that took him in and eventually helped guide him safely back to his own mother and siblings, still waiting anxiously and uncertain of his fate. This episode matters far beyond its obvious dramatic value as a thrilling escape story. It is one of the very first moments in Temujin's life where his survival depended entirely on his own resourcefulness, his own nerve, and his own judgment, rather than on his family's former status, his father's now-vanished reputation, or the protection of powerful allies he did not yet have. He had to read an extremely dangerous situation correctly under enormous pressure, act decisively at precisely the right moment with no room for hesitation, and then rely on the willingness of complete strangers, earned, it seems, through some combination of raw daring and simple human sympathy, to see him safely through to the end. The boy who had once depended entirely on the protection and provision of others was beginning, out of sheer brutal necessity, to learn how to depend fully on himself. That hard-won lesson would prove absolutely essential for everything that followed in the years ahead. As Temujin grew slowly into young manhood, his family's desperate situation gradually, painstakingly stabilized, not because their status was ever restored, but simply because they had endured what should, by any reasonable measure, have destroyed them. And it was around this time, with the worst of the immediate crisis behind them, that Temujin returned to something that had been carefully arranged for him years earlier, before his father's sudden death had thrown his entire life into chaos and uncertainty: his betrothal to Borte. Borte was never intended, in this story, to simply function as a passive plot device labeled the future Khan's wife, and she deserves far better than that reduction. She was the daughter of a chief who had extended real, meaningful hospitality and genuine political trust to Yasujii years earlier, at a dream-inspired meeting neither family had planned in advance, and their arranged childhood match represented one of the very few remaining threads of stability and legitimate alliance still connecting Temujin's battered, diminished family to the wider world of steppe politics and recognized social standing. When Temujin finally traveled to claim her as his bride, years after that first meeting, it was both a deeply personal act and a calculated political one, woven together inseparably, the re-establishment of a bond that predated his family's total collapse, a clear signal to the wider steppe world that despite everything that had happened in the intervening years, the promises made in his father's lifetime could still, against considerable odds, be honored in full. Their marriage was not simply a wedding ceremony. It was Temujin beginning, for the very first time since his father's death, to build something genuinely his own, a household, a true partnership, and eventually a family and a political base entirely separate from the wreckage his family had barely survived. Borte would go on to become one of the single most important figures in his entire life, a wife whose counsel he would trust implicitly for decades to come, and whose sons would become absolutely central to the succession and future of the empire he could not possibly have imagined building at this early stage of his life. But this new and hard-won stability did not last long at all. Soon after the marriage was finally celebrated, disaster struck once again, and this time it struck directly at the very heart of what Temujin had only just begun to build for himself. A group of Merkit raiders, from the very same tribe from which Yasujii had, years earlier, violently abducted Holun in the act that had brought her into his household in the first place, attacked Temujin's camp without warning, and it is difficult, reading the accounts, not to interpret this as an act of long-delayed and carefully remembered revenge, an old grievance finally being repaid, brutally, on the next generation of the family. Temujin managed to escape the initial chaos of the attack himself, fleeing quickly to the safety of nearby high, forested ground where mounted raiders could not easily follow. But Borte did not manage to escape in time. She was captured in the confusion and carried off by the raiders, back toward Merkit territory. This was one of the first true crises of Temujin's adult life, and it must have struck him with a particular, deeply personal resonance that went beyond ordinary grief or anger. The abduction of a wife by raiders was, after all, precisely how his own mother had first entered his father's household years before he was even born. Now that same brutal, deeply embedded custom of the steppe had reached directly into his own life and taken from him the woman he had only just married, echoing his own family's origin story in the cruelest possible way. His immediate reaction, according to tradition, was one of genuine anguish and burning fury. But what followed reveals something crucial and defining about how Temujin's mind actually worked, even at this relatively early and difficult stage of his young adult life. He did not simply charge alone after the Merkit raiders in some desperate, doomed, and purely emotional rescue attempt, the kind of reckless gesture that would almost certainly have gotten him killed for nothing. He understood instead, with a clarity of judgment that would come to define his entire future career as a leader, that he did not possess anywhere near the strength required to solve this particular crisis by himself. He needed allies, and not just any allies, but powerful ones capable of actually matching Merkit's strength in open conflict. And so, rather than acting purely out of raw, unfiltered emotion, Temujin turned deliberately to the two most significant relationships of this entire next stage of his life. Togrul, the powerful and well-established Khan of the Karait tribe, and Jamuka, a close childhood friend who would go on to become, in turn, his closest and most trusted ally, and eventually his bitterest and most tragic rival. Togrul, Khan of the Karaits, was already an established and genuinely powerful figure across the wider steppe, commanding far greater resources and manpower than Temujin's own small following, and crucially, he had once sworn a formal oath of friendship with Temujin's own father, a kind of ritualized blood brotherhood, called Anda in Mongol tradition, considered one of the most sacred and binding personal bonds available in steppe society. Temujin approached Togrul not as a desperate stranger begging for an unearned favor, but as the son of an old sworn friend, calling in an inherited bond of loyalty and obligation, reinforced appropriately with respectful gifts befitting the seriousness of the relationship being invoked. Togrul, recognizing both the weight of that inherited obligation and the real political opportunity of gaining a capable, ambitious young ally who might prove useful in future conflicts, agreed to help. Jamuka's role in this unfolding story is, if anything, even more significant than Togrul's, because his relationship with Temujin would become one of the defining emotional threads running through the entire rest of Part 1 of this story. The two young men had known each other since early childhood, having sworn their own oath of Anda, of blood brotherhood, when they were still just boys, well before either of them had any notion of the power either would eventually hold. This was a bond considered, within Mongol tradition, to carry weight equal to blood kinship itself, and sometimes, in practice, weight even greater, since it was a bond genuinely chosen rather than simply inherited by accident of birth. As children, They had exchanged small personal gifts as tokens of their bond, hunted together across familiar ground, and shared the kind of deep, formative closeness that only comes from a real and unforced friendship, rather than from pure political calculation. When Temujin found himself in desperate need of help rescuing his abducted wife, it was entirely natural, almost inevitable given their history, that he would turn first to Jamuka, and Jamuka responded not merely as a useful political ally weighing his own advantage, but as someone genuinely honoring a friendship that clearly still mattered deeply to him. It is worth pausing here to actually feel the real weight and warmth of this friendship before it eventually curdles, slowly and tragically, into open rivalry, because the full tragedy of what happens later between these two men only makes complete sense if the bond between them, at this particular point in the story, is understood as entirely genuine and unforced. These were not two calculating rivals cynically feigning affection for mutual advantage. They were two young men who understood each other in a way few others could, who had built something real and lasting together over years of shared experience, and who were, for now at least, about to fight side by side once again, exactly as they had when they were boys. With Togrul and Jamuka's combined forces joined to his own small following, Temujin launched a coordinated campaign against the Merkits, striking quickly and decisively at their camp. The attack succeeded completely. The Merkit encampment was overrun in the chaos of a surprise assault, and in the confusion that followed, Temujin was at last reunited with Borte. It was, by every surviving account, an intensely emotional reunion, a wife recovered from what could very easily have become a permanent and irreversible loss, and a marriage salvaged from the brink of disaster. There has long been genuine historical discussion and debate surrounding the birth of Temujin and Borte's first son, Joki, given the timing of his birth relative to Borte's period of captivity among the Merkits, a question the surviving sources themselves do not resolve definitively one way or the other. It is a subject best handled honestly, with real acknowledgement of its genuine uncertainty rather than false confidence in either direction, and it is worth noting here, plainly, that Temujin himself never publicly treated the question as grounds for doubting or diminishing Joki's place as his true son within the family, though this same lingering question would, in fact, echo forward into later disputes over succession, long after this particular early crisis had passed and been resolved. But the successful rescue of Borte meant something far larger and more consequential than the recovery of one family's happiness. It was, for Temujin personally, a genuine turning point in his own understanding of how power actually worked on the steppe. Alone, he had been essentially helpless against the Merkits, unable even to attempt a rescue. With allies gathered around him, he had not only recovered everything he had lost, he had won a real and decisive victory, gathered meaningful plunder from the defeated camp, and demonstrated clearly to the wider steppe world that he was someone genuinely capable of forming effective alliances and winning real battles when it mattered most. Temujin was no longer merely a survivor scraping by on the desperate margins of steppe society, dependent entirely on the charity of others. He had begun, almost by pure necessity born of crisis, to build something that increasingly resembled a genuine political network of his own, and it was becoming clear, to himself and to those around him, that this particular skill, the skill of building and holding alliances, was where his real and considerable talent actually lay. In the years that followed this hard-won victory, Temujin's reputation began to grow steadily across the wider steppe, and with that growing reputation came something entirely new in his life: followers who chose him, drawn to him not by any inherited obligation of blood or old family loyalty, but by genuine, deliberate personal choice. This is one of the most important developments in his entire rise to power, and it deserves to be understood carefully and specifically, rather than reduced to the overly simple explanation that people merely followed him because he happened to be strong. Plenty of strong, capable men existed scattered across the steppe at this time. Raw strength alone did not automatically or reliably produce lasting loyalty. What increasingly set Temujin apart from his rivals, as the years passed, was how he actually treated the people who chose to follow him, in concrete and practical terms. Where much of steppe society still operated firmly on rigid lines of aristocratic birth and inherited tribal status, where a man's position and opportunities were largely fixed and determined by the particular family he happened to be born into. Regardless of his own personal ability, Temujin began to demonstrate a genuinely different and, for many, deeply attractive set of values. He rewarded demonstrated skill, personal courage, and proven loyalty generously and consistently, regardless of a follower's birth, family background, or prior tribal affiliation. Capable men who might otherwise have found their ambitions permanently capped by their comparatively low status under the old tribal order could see, in Temujin's growing following, a genuine and realistic path toward real power and respect, one they could never have hoped for under the traditional hierarchy they had been born into. This mattered enormously, in very practical terms, in a world where a great many talented and ambitious men had very little realistic hope of advancement under the existing order of things. A genuinely skilled warrior born into a minor, low-status family, with no realistic path to real influence or power under the old system, had every rational incentive to gamble his future on a rising leader who visibly and reliably rewarded proven ability over inherited status. Several of Temujin's most important and enduring companions, men who would go on to become his most trusted generals and closest personal advisors in the decades ahead, entered his service during precisely this period, drawn to him for exactly this reason. He offered them something the old tribal order simply did not and could not offer, a genuine future defined by what they could actually do and prove, rather than merely by which family they happened to have been born into. This deliberate willingness to build lasting loyalty through demonstrated merit, rather than relying solely on inherited noble status, would become one of the single most defining and consequential features of the political and military system Temujin was slowly, almost accidentally at first, beginning to construct around himself. For a considerable time after the rescue of Borte, Temujin and Jamuka remained closely allied, their combined forces and followers traveling and camping together, their personal friendship apparently as genuinely strong and warm as it had ever been since childhood. But underneath the visible surface of that continuing friendship, real differences were slowly beginning to surface, differences that would eventually, painfully, prove impossible for either man to fully reconcile. The break between them did not happen suddenly, in a single dramatic moment, and it would be a real mistake to imagine Jamuka simply transforming overnight into some kind of straightforward villain in this story. What the surviving sources suggest instead is a genuine and gradual divergence in how each man had come to understand the very nature of leadership itself. Jamuka's own authority remained rooted more firmly and more comfortably in the traditional aristocratic order of the steppe, a system where personal status followed established lineage, where the old clan hierarchies retained their central importance, and where a leader's followers remained bound to him largely through inherited custom and long-standing tribal identity rather than through personal choice. Temujin, by clear contrast, was increasingly building something genuinely different around himself, a following bound together less by ancient bloodlines and inherited status, and increasingly by direct personal loyalty and consistently demonstrated reward for individual ability, a system that inevitably began, over time, to draw ambitious people away from the older tribal structures that Jamuka still represented and continued to rely upon. As the months passed and the two men's camps continued to travel together, this underlying divergence created real and growing friction beneath the surface. Their combined followers began, gradually and almost imperceptibly at first, to sort themselves according to temperament and ambition, some gravitating more naturally and comfortably toward Jamuka's more traditional, familiar style of leadership, others increasingly drawn instead to Temujin's newer, more merit-based, and individually rewarding approach. According to the secret history, an ambiguous remark made by Jamuka concerning the planned movement of their combined camp was interpreted by some of the traveling households as a veiled insult, or perhaps as a subtle signal of shifting personal favor away from certain families, and this misunderstanding, layered directly on top of the deeper political and philosophical differences already quietly growing between the two men, proved to be the immediate spark that finally split their long alliance apart. A significant portion of the shared camp and its followers made the deliberate choice to leave together with Temujin, rather than remain under Jamuka's more traditional leadership. It is worth sitting with, for a moment, just how genuinely significant this particular rupture actually was in the larger arc of this story. This was not merely the practical dissolution of a political alliance of temporary convenience, the kind of split that happened routinely across the steppe. It was the painful ending of a friendship that had, at its true foundation, been entirely genuine and deeply personal. Two boys who had once exchanged simple childhood gifts and sworn sacred blood brotherhood to one another, now finding themselves, as grown men, the separate leaders of increasingly divided and increasingly opposed followings. Temujin was not simply gaining a formidable political rival in Jamuka at this moment. He was losing, in the process, someone who had once known him more intimately and completely than almost anyone else still alive. What followed this painful split was not, by any means, an unbroken and effortless march toward eventual triumph. It would be genuinely dishonest, and frankly a disservice to the real and considerable difficulty of what Temujin ultimately achieved, to portray his continuing rise from this point forward as some kind of smooth, inevitable ascent. He suffered real and significant defeats in the years that followed. On at least one particularly notable occasion, forces loyal to Jamuka inflicted a serious and costly defeat on Temujin's own followers in open battle, a reversal severe enough that it forced Temujin into a full retreat, compelling him to regroup his scattered forces rather than press forward with any confidence. There were other genuine setbacks during this period as well, moments where carefully built alliances proved unexpectedly fragile, where his forces found themselves outmaneuvered by more experienced rivals, and where his eventual rise to supreme power looked, from the perspective of anyone watching at the time, very far from inevitable or assured. What ultimately mattered, looking back on this turbulent period, was not that Temujin somehow managed to avoid defeat entirely, because he did not. It was that he consistently, repeatedly found ways to recover fully from every defeat he suffered. Time and again throughout these difficult years, he demonstrated a genuinely remarkable ability to absorb a serious loss, honestly reassess his position and his mistakes, methodically rebuild his scattered following, and return to the field stronger and wiser than he had been before, a recurring pattern that would come to define his entire career from this point forward, right through to his eventual, hard-won unification of the entire steppe. His later victories feel genuinely earned in this story precisely because they were built directly on top of real, painful failures, honestly survived rather than conveniently skipped over or minimized in the telling. Among the most significant and personally resonant of the conflicts Temujin fought during this long period of gradual consolidation was his prolonged, bitter struggle against the Tatars, the very same tribal confederation whose poison meal had killed his father decades earlier, setting this entire story in motion in the first place. The historical relationship between the Mongols and the Tatars was already deeply and mutually adversarial by this point, layered thickly with generations of raids, feuds, and unresolved grievances stretching back well before Temujin's own lifetime even began. His father's death at Tatar hands naturally gave this ongoing rivalry a particularly sharp and personal edge for Temujin himself, but it would be inaccurate and overly simplistic to portray the entire conflict as being driven purely by personal revenge alone. It was also, just as importantly, a hard-fought struggle over territory, grazing rights, resources, and overall dominance among the major competing powers of eastern Mongolia. Temujin, now allied more closely and more formally with Togrul following their earlier successful cooperation, joined a coordinated campaign against the Tatars, and the resulting military victory proved genuinely significant for his continuing rise. It substantially weakened one of the major rival powers actively contesting control of the steppe, brought Temujin considerable plunder, and enhanced personal prestige among his growing following, and, just as importantly for his long-term strategy, brought a meaningful portion of the defeated Tatar people themselves directly under his own authority, rather than simply scattering them to the winds or exterminating them outright. This outcome foreshadowed a pattern that would become absolutely central to his later, larger success across the wider steppe, the deliberate practice of absorbing defeated peoples into his own growing following, rather than merely eliminating them and leaving a power vacuum behind. It is worth being genuinely cautious here, as elsewhere in this story, about some of the more extreme casualty figures and dramatic claims that later chronicle traditions attached to this and other similar campaigns. Medieval chroniclers, both Mongol and non-Mongol alike, were consistently prone to significant exaggeration in both directions depending on their particular political purposes, and modern historians generally treat the largest and most dramatic reported numbers from this period with considerable and well-justified skepticism. Temujin's relationship with Togrul, meanwhile, continued to steadily deepen throughout this period, for a time at least. Togrul had proven himself, again and again, to be an essential and genuinely valuable ally. First in the successful rescue of Borte, and now again in the hard-fought campaign against the Tatars, and their ongoing partnership brought real, tangible benefits to both men involved. But alliances built primarily on mutual convenience, as Temujin had already painfully learned once before with Jamuka, rarely remain fully stable forever, especially as one partner's power and independent following begin to grow noticeably faster than the others. As Temujin's own following, reputation, and independent influence continued to expand steadily across the steppe, the underlying dynamic between him and Togrul inevitably began to shift in ways that grew increasingly uncomfortable for both sides. Marriage proposals specifically intended to bind their two households more closely and permanently together were, at certain critical points, quietly rebuffed, and the ongoing political maneuvering surrounding questions of succession within Togrul's own Kharat leadership structure grew increasingly tangled and contentious. Rivals operating within Togrul's own inner circle, including, at various points, figures closely aligned with Jamuka himself, who had by this stage successfully positioned himself as a genuine alternative center of power and influence on the wider steppe, worked deliberately and persistently to poison the relationship between Temujin and his once thoroughly reliable ally, repeatedly warning Togrul that his increasingly powerful junior partner might well eventually become a serious and unmanageable threat to Togrul's own position, rather than remaining a useful and subordinate asset. Eventually, this simmering and carefully cultivated distrust broke decisively into open betrayal. Temujin, invited to a meeting under circumstances that appeared, on the surface, to suggest entirely friendly and routine intentions, narrowly avoided a carefully planned ambush intended to eliminate him permanently, managing to escape with only a small band of loyal followers, while much of his larger overall following was caught completely unprepared elsewhere and subsequently scattered or captured outright by the attacking forces. This was, without any real exaggeration, one of the single most dangerous moments in Temujin's entire life up to this point, a moment when everything he had spent years of hardship and careful effort painstakingly rebuilding after his father's death seemed genuinely on the verge of collapsing all over again, just as completely as it had collapsed the first time. He was forced into desperate flight with only a handful of his most loyal men remaining at his side, reduced, according to tradition, to drinking muddy, stagnant water directly from a small watering hole simply to survive the ordeal. A stark and deliberately preserved image within Mongol tradition of just how far he had fallen from the position of real strength and influence he had so painstakingly built over the preceding years. But once again, exactly as he had after every previous catastrophe in his life, Temujin did not simply vanish into the wilderness and disappear from history. He regrouped his remaining forces with characteristic determination. He reached out patiently to the scattered remnants of his larger following, and remarkably, a great many of them chose to return to him voluntarily, a genuine testament to the deep and lasting loyalty his earlier, consistent treatment of capable men, regardless of their birth or background, had carefully cultivated over the preceding years of struggle. According to tradition, at this particular critical low point in his fortunes, he gathered together the loyal men who had stood firmly by him throughout this latest crisis at a place remembered in Mongol tradition as Baljuna, and there swore a solemn oath with them, personally promising to share whatever fortune the future might bring, whether good or bad, equally with the men who had proven their loyalty to him during his darkest and most desperate hour. Whether every specific detail of this particular moment survived down through the centuries exactly as later tradition eventually remembered and recorded it, the underlying historical reality remains genuinely clear. Temujin's remarkable ability to inspire and reliably retain deep personal loyalty, even at his very lowest and most vulnerable point, was steadily becoming one of his single greatest assets as a leader, arguably more valuable in the long run than any battlefield victory. Rebuilding his strength methodically over the following months, Temujin eventually turned to confront Togrul directly and decisively, and in the hard-fought campaign that followed, he achieved a genuinely decisive and complete victory over the Karaits, one of the single most powerful tribal confederations on the entire Mongolian steppe at that time. Togrul himself did not survive the sudden collapse of his once formidable power, killed while fleeing in desperation through the contested territory of yet another rival group who had no particular reason to show him any mercy or hospitality. The dramatic fall of the Karaits marked an absolutely enormous shift in the overall balance of power across the whole of Mongolia, and what Temujin chose to do in the immediate aftermath of this victory reveals, once again and with growing clarity, the underlying strategic logic that would come to define his entire approach to conquest throughout the rest of his life. He did not simply destroy or scatter the defeated Karait people in the aftermath of his victory. He absorbed them systematically into his own growing organization, incorporating their experienced warriors, their households, and their considerable resources directly into his own expanding following, deliberately redistributing them among his most loyal and trusted commanders rather than leaving them intact as a separate, potentially rebellious population capable of organizing future resistance. Temujin was not merely eliminating rivals one by one as he encountered them. With every successive victory, he was actively constructing something genuinely new and unprecedented on the steppe, an entirely new political order, built directly and deliberately from the very people he had just defeated in battle. With the powerful Karaits now gone from the political map entirely, only one truly major rival power remained standing between Temujin and complete, unchallenged control of the entire Mongolian steppe. The Naimans, a powerful and well-organized confederation located to the west, and, significantly for this story, the very place where Jamukha himself had ultimately taken refuge after the long, slow, and painful collapse of his own once-independent following over the preceding years. The Naimans possessed a substantial, well-equipped, and genuinely well-organized military force, and their eventual defeat was neither swift nor in any way guaranteed in advance. But by this particular stage of his long and difficult career, Temujin commanded not merely a numerically larger following than he once had, but a genuinely disciplined and thoroughly battle-hardened one, forged and tempered through years of setbacks, betrayals, and hard-won recoveries from disaster. In the extended campaign that followed, Temujin's forces decisively defeated the Naimans in the field, shattering once and for all the last major organized power on the steppe still capable of seriously contesting his growing dominance. It was in the immediate wake of this final major campaign against the Naimans that Jamukha's long and genuinely complicated personal arc within this story finally reached its tragic conclusion. Having already lost his own independent following years earlier following their painful split, and having now watched his final available refuge among the Naimans collapse completely as well, Jamukha was eventually captured, by some surviving accounts betrayed directly into Temujin's hands by his own remaining followers, who apparently hoped to win favor and mercy from the now clearly victorious Temujin by personally delivering his old rival and former blood brother to him in chains. What passed between the two men during this final meeting deserves to be treated with genuine emotional weight and seriousness in this story, rather than being reduced to a simple, tidy matter of a defeated enemy being disposed of efficiently. These were, after all, two men who had once sworn sacred blood brotherhood as boys, who had fought bravely side by side to rescue Borte from the Merkits, who had shared, for a genuine time, something that looked very much like a shared vision of what their futures together might hold. According to tradition, Temujin personally offered to renew their old friendship one final time, inviting Jamukha to rejoin him as an ally rather than face certain execution as a defeated rival. Jamukha, according to the traditional account, respectfully declined this offer, reportedly stating that their two paths had by now diverged too completely and too painfully to ever be walked together again as they once had, and that he would genuinely prefer to die outright rather than live on in permanent subordination to the man who had once been, in every meaningful sense, his equal and his brother. It is worth explicitly noting here that these are attributed words preserved through generations of oral and later written tradition, not any kind of verified historical transcript of the actual conversation, and they should be understood as reflecting, first and foremost, how later Mongol collective memory chose to frame this particular pivotal and genuinely tragic moment in their shared history. Jamuka was executed shortly afterward, and by most traditional accounts, Temujin took care to ensure he was given a death considered honorable according to steppe custom, avoiding the shedding of his blood directly, rather than a deliberately humiliating one. A final and genuinely complicated gesture of respect toward the man who had once been, quite simply, the closest thing to a true brother he had ever had by his own choice, rather than by accident of birth. It would be a real disservice to the honesty of this story to treat Jamuka's death as simple, satisfying revenge, a neat and tidy ending to a straightforward rivalry. It was, rather, the final chapter of a genuine and lasting tragedy. Two young men who had once imagined, however briefly and however sincerely, a shared future together as equals, who had instead become, through a slow accumulation of circumstance and diverging ambition, the two great opposing poles around which the entire fractured steppe eventually reorganized itself, and who ultimately could not find any way to remain standing on the same side of that painful, historic division. With the Tatars, the Karates, and now the Naimans all thoroughly defeated or fully absorbed into his own growing organization, and Jamuka's long resistance finally and permanently at an end, Temujin now stood, for the first time in his entire life, as the unchallenged supreme power across virtually the entire Mongolian steppe. But genuine unification meant considerably more than simply defeating every rival power in open battle, one after another. It meant building something durable enough to actually hold together over time, a task Temujin approached with exactly the same practical, results-driven instincts that had guided his entire long rise from the very beginning of this story. He restructured Mongol society itself in ways specifically and deliberately designed to cut across the old tribal divisions that had fueled generations of destructive feuding across the steppe. Rather than allowing the various defeated peoples to remain organized comfortably under their old, familiar tribal identities and traditional leadership structures, a recipe, given the entire history of the steppe up to this point, for near-certain future rebellion and renewed fragmentation. Temujin instead redistributed conquered populations systematically across entirely new military and administrative units, deliberately breaking down the old clan loyalties in favor of a new structure built directly around personal loyalty to himself as supreme leader. Central to this sweeping reorganization was the now famous decimal military system, in which the entire army was carefully organized into units of 10, 100, 1,000, and ultimately 10,000 men, with commanders appointed at every level largely on the basis of demonstrated personal loyalty and proven ability rather than inherited noble status. The very same meritocratic instinct that had drawn so many capable followers to him in the first place during his years of struggle, now formally institutionalized into the fundamental structure of an entire unified nation. This new system produced a genuinely remarkable degree of discipline and internal cohesion across the newly unified Mongol forces. Warriors were now bound not primarily to their old tribal chiefs, whose personal loyalties might waver or shift with changing circumstances, but directly to the new decimal structure itself and, ultimately, to Temujin personally as its acknowledged head. Communication across the truly vast distances of the open steppe was maintained through carefully organized relay systems of dedicated scouts and messengers, allowing critical information and orders to move across the entire territory with a speed and reliability that older, more fragmented and loosely organized tribal confederations simply could not hope to match under any circumstances. Horses, as they always had been throughout this entire story, remained the essential foundation of everything: mobility, supply, and rapid communication, all depending entirely on the extraordinary horsemanship that had been bred into ordinary Mongol life since earliest childhood, long before any of this larger political structure had even existed. None of this organizational sophistication made Mongol forces simply and vaguely unstoppable in some mythical, almost supernatural sense. The way later legend would sometimes suggest. It made them exceptionally well-organized, genuinely disciplined, and remarkably adaptable in the field, capable of coordinating and striking with a combination of speed and cohesion that most of their remaining rivals, still operating under older and looser tribal structures, simply could not match or effectively counter. Before turning at last to the true culmination of this long and difficult unification struggle, it is worth pausing to return briefly to the more personal, human side of Temujin's life, because even as he was busy building an entirely new political order across the whole of Mongolia, he was also, quietly and steadily, building a family whose own future would eventually become completely inseparable from the future of the empire he had not yet even begun to imagine on any grand scale. Borte remained his primary wife and closest personal confidant throughout all of these turbulent years, and together they raised 4 sons who would each grow, in time, into central and consequential figures within the larger story of the Mongol Empire. Joki, the eldest, whose exact parentage remained a subject of quiet but persistent uncertainty given the particular circumstances surrounding his birth so soon after Borte's rescue from Merkit captivity, a question Temujin himself never publicly allowed to diminish or complicate Joki's rightful place within the family, even as it would, in later years, come to genuinely complicate difficult questions of eventual succession. Chagatai, known throughout his life for his notably strict and unwavering adherence to Mongol law and inherited tradition, Ogdi, whose considerably more diplomatic and even-tempered personal temperament would eventually see him deliberately chosen by his father to succeed him as ruler, and Tauyui, the youngest of the 4 brothers, whose own descendants would ultimately come to dominate the later, even larger Mongol Empire in the generations that followed. Even at this comparatively early stage in the story, well before Temujin had claimed any grand new title for himself, the difficult question of what would eventually happen to everything he was so carefully building after his own inevitable death had already, quietly but unmistakably, become a live and genuinely complicated family matter, one that would only grow more urgent and more contentious as his power continued to expand. By the year 1206, the long, brutal, and genuinely decades-long journey that had begun so many years earlier with an abandoned widow and her starving children left alone on the open steppe had finally reached its true and hard-won culmination. The major rival tribal confederations that had once dominated the political landscape of Mongolia, the Tatars, the Karaits, the Naimans, the Merkits, and the scattered followers of Jamukha himself, had all now been thoroughly defeated, absorbed, or scattered beyond any hope of meaningful reorganization. For the very first time in living memory, and quite possibly for the very first time in the region's entire recorded history, the diverse and historically fractious peoples of the Mongolian steppe stood genuinely unified under the authority of a single supreme ruler. To formally mark and celebrate this entirely new political reality, Temujin called together a great Kurultai, a formal gathering of Mongol leaders and notable men from across the newly unified steppe, convened near the source of the Onon River, in the very same region where his own turbulent and difficult childhood had originally unfolded so many years earlier. This was not merely an empty ceremonial formality staged for show. The Kurultai represented the genuine and collective political recognition of the tribal and clan leaders now scattered across the whole of the newly unified steppe, a very public and formal acknowledgement that Temujin's authority no longer rested solely on the fact of his recent military conquests, but was now willingly accepted by his former rivals as the fully legitimate governing order of the Mongol people as a unified whole. It was at this historic gathering that Temujin formally received the title by which world history would come to know him from that point forward. Genghis Khan, sometimes also rendered as Chinggis Khan, generally understood to mean something reasonably close to oceanic or universal ruler, a title deliberately chosen to convey authority extending as vast, as boundless, and as ultimately unstoppable as the sea itself. The precise linguistic origin and exact etymology of the title remains genuinely debated among modern scholars to this day, but its underlying meaning was entirely unmistakable to everyone actually present at the gathering that day. This was no longer merely a chief of one modest clan among many others, forced to constantly contest for dominance against numerous rivals. This was, for the very first time in the region's history, a single supreme ruler standing over the entire unified Mongol nation as a whole. It is genuinely worth pausing here to fully register the extraordinary distance this one man had personally traveled to finally arrive at this remarkable moment. The boy who had watched his own father die slowly of poison. The boy whose family's own loyal followers had abandoned a starving widow and her helpless children out on the open steppe without a second thought. The boy who had killed his own half-brother in a desperate, brutal struggle over scarce and precious food. The boy who had worn a slave's heavy wooden collar as a humiliated captive of his own family's enemies, and had escaped only through sheer nerve, quick thinking, and the unexpected mercy of complete strangers. The young man who had lost his own newly married wife to enemy raiders, and who had needed the help of powerful allies simply to get her back safely. The struggling leader who had been betrayed by a trusted ally, ambushed nearly to the point of death, reduced at one point to drinking muddy water from a stagnant hole in the ground alongside a mere handful of loyal men, genuinely wondering whether everything he had worked so hard to build was about to collapse completely all over again, just as it once had before. That same boy, against every reasonable expectation anyone might have had for his life, was now the supreme and unchallenged ruler of the entire Mongolian steppe. With his new authority now formally and publicly established before the assembled leaders of his people, Genghis Khan did not remain content for long with control over Mongolia alone, however hard-won and historically unprecedented that achievement genuinely was. Almost immediately following the Kurultai, his attention began turning steadily outward, toward the wealthy, settled kingdoms bordering the steppe to the south, kingdoms whose rulers had, for generations, largely dismissed the fractured tribes of Mongolia as a chronic nuisance rather than any kind of serious threat. His first major military campaigns beyond Mongolia's traditional borders were directed first against Xia, a kingdom ruled by the Tangut people to the southwest, and somewhat later against the far larger and more powerful Jin dynasty, which ruled over much of northern China at the time. Campaigns that together marked the very beginning of the Mongols' remarkable transformation from a newly unified steppe power into something considerably larger and more consequential still, an empire now, actively expanding well beyond the familiar world Genghis Khan himself had grown up struggling to survive within. These earliest campaigns beyond Mongolia's borders were, in many genuine respects, a direct continuation and further refinement of everything Genghis Khan had already painstakingly built over the preceding decades. The very same disciplined military structure, the same emphasis on speed, mobility, careful coordination, and battlefield adaptability that had allowed him to gradually unify the fractured and warring tribes of the steppe, now began to be tested for the first time against the fortified cities, professional standing armies, and considerably more complex political systems of established, settled civilizations. An entirely different kind of military and political challenge than the tribal warfare he had spent his entire life up to this point mastering. It was here, in these very earliest campaigns against Xia and the Jin, that the Mongol military machine, forged and tempered through decades of brutal internal steppe conflict, first began to genuinely demonstrate what it was truly capable of when finally turned outward against the wider world beyond the borders of Mongolia itself. Genghis Khan had spent his entire life up to this point fighting, first simply to survive at all, then fighting to rebuild what his father's sudden death had so thoroughly destroyed, then fighting to gather reliable allies, to recover repeatedly from betrayal and defeat, to overcome the powerful rival tribes that had once seemed genuinely unassailable to a starving boy on the open steppe. Now, for the very first time in his remarkable life, he commanded not a small, struggling following barely scraping by on the desperate margins of steppe society, but a fully organized state, a thoroughly disciplined army, and a rapidly growing sphere of influence that had already, within a remarkably short span of time, begun pressing steadily beyond the traditional borders of Mongolia itself. The abandoned child who had once foraged desperately for wild roots and river fish simply to survive one more winter now commanded a force genuinely capable of reshaping the entire map of Eurasia. And the wider world beyond the steppe, vast, wealthy, and for the most part almost entirely unaware of what had been, quietly gathering strength on its northern horizon for so many years, was about to discover, in the years immediately ahead, exactly what that force was truly capable of. That story, the story of empire, of conquest across half the known world, and of everything that came after the historic Kurultai of 1206, belongs to what comes next. The steppe itself could no longer contain what Genghis Khan had built. An army forged through decades of betrayal, exile, and hard-won recovery now existed for a purpose beyond simple survival. And the question facing its creator was no longer how to stay alive, but what to do with the power he now commanded. To the south and east lay two very different kinds of enemies than anything the Mongols had faced before. Not rival clans on horseback, but settled kingdoms with walls, bureaucracies, and standing armies that had never taken the tribes of Mongolia seriously as a threat. Everything the Mongols knew about warfare had been built on the open steppe. Speed, mobility, the ability to strike, vanish, and strike again before an enemy could organize a response. That knowledge would remain essential, but it would not be enough on its own. Fortified cities could not be outmaneuvered the way a rival camp could. Walls did not retreat. A siege required patience, engineering, and a completely different set of skills than anything a lifetime of steppe warfare had taught. What made the years that followed so consequential was not simply that the Mongols began winning battles beyond their homeland. It was that Genghis Khan, already in his 40s by the standards most historians estimate, proved willing to learn an entirely new kind of war, absorbing expertise wherever he found it, adapting his methods to each new enemy rather than repeating a single formula and hoping it would work everywhere. The first real test of this came with the kingdom of Xia, a state ruled by the Tangut people, occupying territory to the southwest of Mongolia along the edge of the Gobi Desert. Xia was not among the great powers of the era, but it controlled valuable trade routes and stood between Mongolia and the wealthier lands further south, making it a natural first target for a leader testing his army's capabilities beyond tribal warfare. The Tanguts maintained fortified towns and cities, a settled agricultural population, and a government with its own administrative structure, a different world entirely from anything Temujin had grown up navigating. The Mongol campaigns against Xia unfolded across several years rather than in a single swift stroke, and they reveal something important about how Genghis Khan actually operated, in contrast to the simplified image of him as a purely destructive force. His army struck at Xia on more than one occasion, and each time, they encountered the same basic problem: a fortified capital that could not simply be ridden down the way an open camp could. Early attempts to take Tangut strongholds by direct assault proved costly and inconclusive, and Genghis Khan adjusted his approach accordingly, combining military pressure with negotiation rather than relying on siege alone. Xia's rulers, recognizing the danger they faced, eventually agreed to submit and pay tribute, becoming a subordinate state within the growing Mongol sphere of influence rather than being immediately destroyed outright. It would not be the final chapter of the relationship between the Mongols and the Tanguts, but for now, it gave Genghis Khan something valuable: his first real experience testing his army against walled cities, and his first real lesson in the value of combining force with diplomacy, rather than treating every conflict as a battle to be won purely by the sword. That lesson mattered enormously, because the next enemy Genghis Khan chose to confront was in an entirely different category altogether. The Jin dynasty ruled over much of northern China, and it was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most powerful states in the entire world at that time. Its territory contained millions of people, a level of population that dwarfed anything the united Mongol tribes could field even at full strength. Its cities were larger and more fortified than anything in Xia, protected by walls that had been built and rebuilt over centuries. Its government commanded professional standing armies, organized tax systems, and administrative structures refined over generations of settled rule. For much of Mongol history, the Jin had been regarded not as a rival to be defeated, but as an overwhelming power to be placated, paid tribute to, or simply avoided. Earlier Mongol leaders, including men from Genghis Khan's own family generations back, had suffered humiliation at Jin hands, and the relationship between the steppe tribes and the Jin court had long been one of unequal power, weighted heavily in the settled empire's favor. This made the decision to challenge the Jin an enormous statement in itself, beyond its military implications. It signaled that Genghis Khan no longer regarded his newly unified Mongol nation as a regional power operating in the shadow of its southern neighbor. It signaled that he now believed his army, forged through the long unification of the steppe, was capable of confronting the single most formidable state in the region. The invasion that followed exposed both the strengths and the real limitations of Mongol warfare when applied against a settled empire. In open terrain, Mongol cavalry proved devastatingly effective, outmaneuvering Jin forces, exploiting gaps in their defenses, and winning a series of significant early victories that pushed deep into Jin territory. But the fortified cities of northern China presented a genuinely difficult problem. Mongol horsemen, no matter how skilled, could not simply ride over walls built to withstand exactly this kind of assault. Sieges against major Jin strongholds proved slow, costly, and at times unsuccessful outright. Genghis Khan's response to this challenge is one of the more revealing episodes of his career because it shows a leader willing to fundamentally rethink his own methods rather than stubbornly repeating what had worked before. Rather than relying solely on cavalry and improvisation, the Mongols began actively seeking out and incorporating specialists from among their defeated and captured populations. Engineers who understood siege machinery, administrators who understood how to govern conquered territory rather than simply plunder it, and translators and advisors who could help navigate the complex political landscape of a civilization utterly unlike anything on the steppe. Chinese and Khitan engineers, some captured, some who defected voluntarily to a rising power that offered them more opportunity than a crumbling Jin court, brought with them knowledge of siege engines, catapults, and other technology the Mongols had never needed during their years of purely tribal warfare. This absorption of outside expertise would become one of the defining features of Mongol expansion going forward, the recognition that conquest alone was not enough, and that an army built for the open steppe had to be transformed, piece by piece, into something capable of taking and eventually administering an empire. The war against the Jin would, in fact, continue for years beyond the timeframe this story is about to move into, eventually concluding only after Genghis Khan's own death, carried forward by his successors. But its early phase accomplished something crucial for the man who had once been an abandoned child fighting simply to survive the winter. It proved that the political and military system he had built to unify the steppe could be adapted to challenge even the greatest powers of the settled world. Genghis Khan was no longer merely the ruler of Mongolia. He was becoming something considerably larger, and the world beyond his own borders was only beginning to understand what that meant. Far to the west, across deserts, mountain ranges, and thousands of miles of territory the Mongols had never previously had reason to think about, an entirely different world existed, one that had, until this point, had almost no meaningful contact with the rising power on the steppe. The Khwarezmian Empire, by the early 13th century, controlled an enormous swath of Central Asia, stretching across territory that today includes parts of modern Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Iran, and Afghanistan. It was one of the great Islamic powers of its era, ruled by Shah Muhammad II, a monarch who commanded vast wealth, controlled some of the most important trading cities along the Silk Road, and fielded armies numbering, by most estimates, in the hundreds of thousands when fully mobilized. Its cities, Bokhara, Samarkand, Urgench, and others, were among the great urban centers of the medieval world, home to scholars, merchants, and craftsmen, their markets filled with goods flowing between China, India, the Middle East, and Europe. Compared to this, even the newly unified Mongol Empire, formidable as it had become, was still, in the eyes of most observers at the time, a distant and comparatively unfamiliar power from the northeastern edge of the known world. There was, at this early point in the story, no obvious reason why these two empires needed to go to war at all. Genghis Khan's interests, as his campaigns against Xia and the Jin demonstrate, were focused primarily on securing his southern and eastern borders and establishing Mongol dominance over the territories closest to his homeland. The Khwarezmian Empire, meanwhile, was preoccupied with its own regional rivalries and internal tensions, including uneasy relationships between Shah Muhammad II and various factions within his own court and military. Neither side, as this story reaches this moment, was inevitably destined for conflict. What happened next did not have to happen the way it did, and understanding that makes what actually occurred considerably more powerful and considerably more tragic than if these two empires had simply been fated to collide from the beginning. What Genghis Khan wanted, at least initially, was trade. The vast network of routes connecting East Asia to Central Asia and the Islamic world, the network later generations would come to call the Silk Road, ran directly through Khwarezmian territory, and Genghis Khan understood the value of commerce as clearly as he understood the value of military organization. A newly unified Mongolia, sitting at the eastern edge of these trade routes, stood to benefit enormously from stable, peaceful commercial relations with the wealthy cities to the west. According to the sources, Genghis Khan initiated contact with Shah Muhammad II with precisely this goal in mind, seeking to establish diplomatic and commercial ties between their two empires rather than confrontation. To formalize this relationship, Genghis Khan dispatched a substantial trade caravan into Khwarezmian territory, made up of merchants, some Mongol, many drawn from among the various peoples now incorporated into the Mongol Empire, carrying valuable goods intended to open a genuine commercial relationship between the two powers. This was not a military expedition disguised as a caravan. It was, by every indication in the sources, a genuine attempt to establish peaceful trade between two of the largest political entities in Eurasia. The caravan's fate would change the course of world history. When the caravan reached the city of Otrar, a Khwarezmian frontier town under the authority of a governor named Inalchuk, something went catastrophically wrong. According to the sources, Inalchuk accused the merchants of being spies, seized their goods, and had the members of the caravan killed. The precise motivations behind this decision are debated among historians. Some accounts suggest simple greed, a governor unable to resist the wealth passing through his territory, while others suggest genuine, if likely unfounded, suspicion of espionage, or perhaps a calculation, whether Inalchuk's own or with tacit approval from higher authority, that provoking the distant Mongols carried little real risk. Whatever the precise motivation, the outcome was the same. A caravan of Mongol-sponsored merchants, traveling under what should have been the protections of diplomatic and commercial custom, was destroyed. Genghis Khan's initial response was not immediate war. He sent envoys directly to Shah Muhammad II, demanding an explanation and calling for the governor responsible to be handed over for punishment, a request that, if honored, would have allowed the crisis to be resolved without triggering a wider conflict. This was consistent with how Genghis Khan had generally approached serious offenses throughout his life, a demand for accountability before a demand for blood. According to most accounts, Shah Muhammad II refused to hand over Inalchuk, and in a further escalation, the sources describe at least one of the envoys being killed and others humiliated, their beards shaved, an act considered a severe insult within the cultural context of the time. Historians remain cautious about the precise details of this episode, as accounts recorded generations later carry the imprint of hindsight and the tendency of chroniclers to dramatize the moment that triggered a world-altering war. But the essential political reality is not seriously disputed. A diplomatic mission sent to resolve a crisis peacefully had instead been met with further humiliation and violence, transforming what had begun as a trade dispute into something that could no longer be resolved through negotiation. What had started as an attempt to open a peaceful commercial relationship between two great powers had, through a combination of greed, miscalculation, and stubborn pride on the Khwarezmian side, become an unambiguous crisis. And now Genghis Khan faced a decision unlike any he had faced before. He had fought and defeated rival tribes across the steppe. He had tested his forces against the fortified cities of Xia and the vast, populous Jin dynasty. But the Khwarezmian Empire was different from anything he had confronted up to this point, not merely in scale, though its scale was genuinely enormous, but in the sheer strategic risk involved in attacking it. Its territory stretched across thousands of miles of desert, mountain, and cultivated land. Its cities were numerous, wealthy, and heavily fortified. Its armies, while perhaps not as cohesive or disciplined as the force Genghis Khan now commanded, vastly outnumbered anything the Mongols could field. An invasion of this scale carried the very real risk of overextension, of an army stretched across impossible distances, vulnerable to being cut off, surrounded, and destroyed piecemeal far from any hope of reinforcement or retreat. And yet, the insult could not simply be absorbed. A ruler who had spent his entire life learning that authority, once shown to be weak or unable to protect its own people, quickly collapsed into irrelevance, understood that failing to respond to the killing of his merchants and the humiliation of his envoys would signal exactly the kind of weakness that, on the steppe, had once caused his own father's followers to abandon a widow and her children without a second thought. Whatever the strategic risks, Genghis Khan made the decision to invade. The preparations that followed were extensive and deliberate, reflecting years of accumulated experience in organizing large-scale, coordinated military campaigns. Rather than committing his forces to a single line of advance, Genghis Khan divided his army into several coordinated columns, each assigned different objectives and different routes into Khwarezmian territory, timed to strike at multiple points nearly simultaneously. This was not a blunt instrument thrown at the largest available target. It was a carefully coordinated operation designed to fracture Khwarezmian defenses before they could concentrate their much larger numbers into a single overwhelming force. Shah Muhammad II, despite commanding armies that dwarfed the Mongol invasion force in raw numbers, struggled from the outset to respond coherently. His forces were dispersed across garrison cities throughout his vast territory, and rather than concentrating them to meet the invasion directly, he largely chose a defensive strategy centered on fortified cities, hoping that Mongol forces would exhaust themselves attempting to besiege one stronghold after another. It proved to be a fatal miscalculation. A larger empire, if its forces cannot be coordinated and concentrated effectively, can still be defeated by a smaller, more mobile force capable of striking multiple targets simultaneously and overwhelming individual garrisons before they can be reinforced. The campaign began, appropriately, at Otrar itself, the city whose governor had set this entire catastrophe in motion. The Mongol siege of Otrar was lengthy and difficult, the city's defenders putting up fierce resistance for months. But the outcome was, in the end, never seriously in doubt. Otrar eventually fell, its defenses overwhelmed, and Inalchuk, the governor whose decision had triggered the entire war, was captured. According to tradition, his punishment was severe and deliberately symbolic, reportedly involving molten silver poured into his eyes and ears as retribution for the greed that had started the conflict. Though as with many specific details from this period, this particular account should be understood as tradition rather than confirmed historical fact, the kind of story that circulated widely and carried clear symbolic weight, whether or not every detail occurred exactly as later chroniclers described it. With Otrar dealt with, the wider Mongol campaign moved deeper into Khwarezmian territory, and the world was about to witness the fall of some of the greatest cities in Central Asia. Bokhara was among the most important cities in the entire Islamic world at that time, a center of learning, trade, and culture that had flourished for centuries, its markets and libraries known across the breadth of the medieval world. When the Mongol army arrived outside its walls, the city's defenders, along with a portion of the broader Khwarezmian military force stationed there, attempted resistance, but organized defense collapsed quickly under the pressure of a coordinated Mongol assault. Much of the city's garrison, along with civilian leaders, ultimately chose surrender rather than continued resistance, opening the gates in an attempt to spare the wider population from the fate that awaited cities that fought to the end. What followed inside Bokhara has become one of the more mythologized episodes of the entire Mongol conquest, and it deserves to be treated with real historical care rather than simple repetition of dramatic legend. According to later Persian chronicles, Genghis Khan entered the city and addressed its inhabitants, reportedly declaring himself an instrument of divine punishment for their sins. This account, most famously preserved in the writing of the Persian historian Javani, should be understood clearly as a tradition recorded by a chronicler writing after the fact, shaped by the literary and religious conventions of his time, rather than a verified transcript of Genghis Khan's actual words. What is better established is that portions of the city, along with elements of the remaining garrison who continued resisting from a citadel within the city even after the broader surrender, suffered severe consequences, while much of the general population was spared outright massacre, though subjected to the plunder, disruption, and hardship that inevitably accompanied a conquering army occupying a major city. Bokhara's fall represented something larger than a single military victory. It represented the sudden, jarring confrontation between a civilization that had existed and flourished for centuries and a military power that, only years earlier, had been fighting for survival on the open steppe. From Bokhara, the campaign moved towards Samarkand, a city that, if anything, carried even greater symbolic and strategic importance. Samarkand was one of the great cities of Central Asia, heavily fortified and defended by a substantial garrison, including war elephants brought into the city's defense, a detail that underscores just how seriously its defenders understood the threat bearing down on them. Despite these defenses, organized resistance at Samarkand collapsed with startling speed once the Mongol army arrived and began its assault. Much of the garrison, recognizing the hopelessness of their position after witnessing what had already happened elsewhere in the empire, either fled, surrendered, or was defeated in the fighting that followed. The city fell within a matter of days rather than the extended siege its defenses might otherwise have suggested were possible. The fall of Samarkand marked a decisive turning point in the wider war. This was no longer simply a punitive campaign aimed at avenging the killing of Mongol merchants and the humiliation of Genghis Khan's envoys. The political order of the entire Khwarezmian Empire was beginning to collapse outright, city by city, faster than Shah Muhammad II could organize any kind of coherent response. And Shah Muhammad II himself, watching this collapse unfold from a position of increasingly desperate helplessness, found his options narrowing with each passing week. Rather than attempting to concentrate his remaining forces for a decisive confrontation, he retreated westward, apparently hoping to reorganize resistance from a position of greater safety, or perhaps simply overwhelmed by the speed and coordination of an enemy his own strategic assumptions had never accounted for. Mongol forces pursued him relentlessly, understanding that as long as the Shah remained free, he could potentially serve as a rallying point for renewed resistance. City after city fell as the pursuit continued, each collapse further eroding whatever remained of Khwarezmian authority and further demoralizing what forces still remained loyal to the fleeing ruler. The psychological effect of this unraveling should not be underestimated. Word of the Mongol advance and of the fate of cities that had resisted traveled ahead of the army itself, and this reputation, this expectation of what awaited those who chose to fight rather than submit, became in itself one of the Mongols' most effective weapons, often weakening the will of a city's defenders before Mongol forces had even arrived at its walls. Shah Muhammad II never managed to reorganize effective resistance. Pursued across his own crumbling empire, increasingly isolated from what remained of his court and his armies, he eventually fled to a small island in the Caspian Sea, where, according to most accounts, he died not long afterward, worn down by exhaustion, illness, and the collapse of everything he had once ruled. The precise circumstances of his final days are not entirely certain, and later accounts vary in their details, but the broader historical reality is unmistakable and requires no embellishment. The ruler of one of the great empires of Central Asia, a man who had commanded armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands, had proven utterly unable to organize any effective response to the Mongol invasion, and had died a fugitive within his own former territory. What followed in the years immediately after was among the darkest chapters of the entire Mongol conquest, and it deserves to be discussed honestly rather than minimized or sensationalized. Across the region of Khorasan and the surrounding territories, Mongol forces continued their campaign against cities that chose continued resistance, or that were suspected of harboring remaining Khwarezmian forces or rebellion. Cities such as Merv, Nishapur, and Herat, among others, experienced devastating consequences during this period, their populations suffering enormous losses in the fighting and its aftermath. Medieval chroniclers, writing sometimes generations after these events, recorded casualty figures for individual cities running into the hundreds of thousands, numbers that modern historians generally treat with considerable skepticism. Given the practical difficulties of accurately counting casualties in this era, the tendency of chroniclers on all sides to exaggerate for dramatic or political effect, and the sheer implausibility of some of the largest reported figures relative to the likely total population of the region at the time. What can be said with much greater confidence, based on archaeological evidence and the broader historical record, is that the scale of destruction across parts of Khorasan was genuinely severe, that agricultural infrastructure critical to the region's population was in many places devastated, and that the demographic and economic consequences for portions of Central Asia were substantial and long-lasting, reshaping the region's population and character for generations. It would be a disservice to this story, however, to reduce the entire Mongol conquest of this region to indiscriminate slaughter, because the actual pattern of Mongol warfare during this campaign, and throughout Genghis Khan's career more broadly, was considerably more calculated than that simplification suggests. Cities that surrendered without prolonged resistance were, in a great many cases, spared the most severe consequences, their populations subjected to plunder and disruption, but not to wholesale destruction. Cities that resisted, particularly those that killed Mongol emissaries or officials sent to negotiate surrender, faced devastating retaliation, intended not merely as punishment for that specific city, but as a deliberate demonstration to every other city still weighing whether resistance was worth the risk. Skilled craftsmen, engineers, scholars, and administrators encountered in conquered territory were frequently spared outright destruction and instead relocated elsewhere within the growing Mongol Empire, their expertise considered too valuable to waste. A continuation of the same pattern already visible in the incorporation of Chinese and Khitan engineers during the campaigns against the Jin. This should not be mistaken for an attempt to excuse or minimize the genuine human catastrophe experienced by the population of Khorasan and the wider region during these years. It should instead be understood as an explanation of the underlying logic driving Mongol conduct, a logic in which fear and reputation functioned as calculated instruments of policy, not merely as byproducts of conquest. The Mongols were not simply fighting armies in open battle. They were actively shaping expectations across an enormous territory about what would happen to those who resisted and what would happen to those who submitted, understanding correctly that this reputation, once firmly established, could conquer cities more efficiently than any siege engine, simply by convincing their defenders that resistance was hopeless before a single arrow had been fired. Amid this sweeping collapse of Khwarezmian authority, one figure emerged who refused to accept that the war was already lost, and his story restores a genuine sense of tension and human resistance to this final chapter of Genghis Khan's campaigns. Jalal al-Din Mangburni was the son of Shah Muhammad II, and unlike his father, who had responded to the Mongol invasion with retreat and, ultimately, collapse, Jalal al-Din chose to fight. In the years following his father's death, he emerged as a genuinely capable military leader, gathering remaining Khwarezmian forces and mounting a series of engagements against Mongol detachments, including at least one significant battle in which his forces inflicted a real defeat on a Mongol army, a rare and notable event during this entire campaign. His resistance demonstrated something important for the wider historical record. The Mongol advance through Central Asia, while extraordinarily successful, was not simply an unstoppable, uncontested march. It could be resisted, and at times, it could be genuinely defeated in the field, at least temporarily. Genghis Khan, upon learning of these setbacks, personally led forces to confront Jalal al-Din directly, understanding that as long as this determined and capable enemy remained free and active, the Khwarezmian resistance retained a genuine rallying point capable of prolonging the conflict indefinitely. The two forces eventually met near the Indus River, in territory in what is now Pakistan, in a battle that would become the dramatic climax of the entire Central Asian campaign. The Battle of the Indus was fought under difficult circumstances for Jalal al-Din, his forces pinned against the river itself with Mongol forces pressing from multiple directions, denying him the room to maneuver that had helped him win his earlier engagements. The battle went badly for the Khwarezmian prince, his forces overwhelmed and largely destroyed in the fighting. But rather than accept capture or death, Jalal al-Din, according to tradition, made a desperate and remarkable choice. Still mounted on his horse, in full armor, he rode directly into the Indus River and swam across it under fire, escaping to the far bank and, ultimately, out of Genghis Khan's immediate reach. The tradition surrounding this moment holds that Genghis Khan, watching this escape from the riverbank, was struck with genuine admiration for his enemy's courage, reportedly remarking to those around him that a father should be fortunate to have a son capable of such an act, and forbidding his own men from pursuing Jalal al-Din into the water. This story, preserved across multiple later chronicles, should be treated as historical tradition rather than a confirmed and verified fact, the kind of dramatic, symbolically resonant moment that later storytellers, both Mongol and Persian, would have every reason to preserve and embellish. But whether or not every detail occurred precisely as later accounts describe, the underlying historical outcome is clear. Jalal al-Din survived the battle, escaped across the Indus, and would continue, for some years afterward, to represent ongoing resistance against Mongol authority in the region, even after the larger Khwarezmian state had already ceased to exist in any meaningful form. With Jalal al-Din's escape, the immediate Central Asian campaign reached its natural conclusion. The Khwarezmian Empire, one of the great powers of the Islamic world only a few years earlier, had been effectively destroyed as an organized state, its cities devastated or absorbed, its ruler dead, and its territory now firmly under Mongol control or influence. But Genghis Khan, already an older man by the standards of his era, had unfinished business waiting for him back toward the heartland of his empire, and the campaign in the west, having accomplished its essential purpose, gradually gave way to a long return eastward. The empire Genghis Khan now presided over had grown into something almost unrecognizable compared to the fractured, feuding steppe he had spent his youth surviving. It stretched from the Pacific coast of East Asia to the edges of Persia and the Caspian Sea, encompassing an enormous diversity of peoples, languages, and cultures under a single, if still developing, political and administrative structure. Increasingly, the empire's continued functioning depended not solely on Genghis Khan's own personal leadership, formidable as it remained, but on the growing network of sons, generals, and administrators he had spent decades cultivating. Commanders such as Subutai and Jeeb, among others, had proven themselves capable of leading major campaigns largely independent of Genghis Khan's direct oversight, a clear sign that the political and military system he had built during the long unification of the steppe was capable of functioning and expanding well beyond what any single individual, however extraordinary, could personally oversee. This growing complexity inevitably returned attention to a question that had first quietly emerged years earlier, back when Genghis Khan's four sons by Borte were still young. What would happen to this enormous, still expanding empire once its founder was no longer alive to hold it together? Joki, the eldest, continued to carry the lingering uncertainty surrounding his parentage, a shadow that had never fully lifted despite Genghis Khan's own consistent public treatment of him as a full and legitimate son. Chagatai, known throughout his life for his rigid insistence on Mongol law and tradition, made no secret of his own skepticism regarding Joki's claim to eventual leadership, a tension that reportedly surfaced openly during discussions of succession, complicating what should, ideally, have been a straightforward matter of passing authority to the eldest son. Ogdi, the third son, possessed a temperament that many around Genghis Khan viewed as better suited to holding together the diverse, increasingly complex empire his father had built, a ruler capable of consensus and administration rather than merely conquest. Talyui, the youngest, inherited significant personal military forces and would come to play a crucial supporting role in the empire's continuing expansion. The question of succession mattered enormously, and not merely as a matter of family politics. Genghis Khan had spent his entire life learning, through repeated and often brutal experience, exactly how quickly power built around a single individual could collapse the moment that individual was no longer present to defend it. His own childhood had been shaped by precisely this lesson, watching his father's authority evaporate the instant Yasujii died. An empire of this size, built so heavily around Genghis Khan's own personal authority and reputation, faced the very real risk of fracturing along exactly these same lines unless a clear and broadly accepted mechanism for succession could be established while its founder was still alive to enforce it. Ultimately, Genghis Khan designated Ogdi as his intended successor, a decision made with the input and eventual acceptance of his other sons, though the full and lasting resolution of these succession tensions would not become entirely clear until after his death. Even as these questions of succession were being worked through, Genghis Khan's attention was drawn back to unfinished business closer to home. Xia, the kingdom that had submitted years earlier following the Mongols' first major campaign beyond the steppe, had, in the years since, grown increasingly unreliable as a subordinate state, and at points had refused to provide the military support obligated under its earlier submission, including during the demanding years of the Khwarezmian campaign. This refusal represented, in Genghis Khan's understanding of loyalty and obligation, precisely the kind of betrayal that could not simply be overlooked, regardless of his advancing age or the demands of overseeing an empire that now stretched across much of Eurasia. The renewed campaign against Xia, launched in the final years of Genghis Khan's life, would prove to be his last military undertaking. It was a determined and, in its final phases, brutal campaign, aimed at ensuring that Xia's defiance would not go unanswered and that no subordinate state within the growing empire could conclude that betrayal carried no meaningful consequence. Mongol forces moved systematically against Tangut strongholds, and the campaign, though hard-fought, proceeded toward what appeared to be a decisive Mongol victory. It was during this final campaign, in the year 1227, that Genghis Khan died. The precise circumstances surrounding his death remain genuinely uncertain, and it would be historically irresponsible to present any single account as definitively established fact. Various traditions offer different explanations. Some sources suggest he died from injuries sustained after a fall from his horse during a hunting expedition. Others suggest illness, an affliction that overtook him during the demands of the campaign. Still other, more legendary traditions offer more dramatic explanations that most historians treat with considerable skepticism. What can be said with reasonable confidence is that Genghis Khan died in August of 1227, somewhere in the vicinity of the ongoing Xia campaign, at an age most historians estimate to have been somewhere in his 60s, though even his exact birth year remains a matter of some scholarly uncertainty. What followed his death reflected the same careful, deliberate instincts that had characterized so much of his life. According to tradition, his death was kept secret for a period of time, and the ongoing campaign against Xia was, by most accounts, brought to its conclusion, with the Tangut kingdom finally and fully subdued, even as the news of the Great Khan's death was withheld from wider circulation. This secrecy was almost certainly a deliberate and calculated decision, intended to prevent panic, rebellion, or renewed conflict among recently conquered or subordinate populations who might have seen the death of the empire's founder as an opportunity to break away. The location of Genghis Khan's burial remains, to this day, unknown, and this was, by every indication in the sources, entirely intentional. Mongol tradition of the period placed enormous importance on concealing the burial sites of great leaders, and the specific measures reportedly taken to ensure secrecy, whether through the deliberate diversion of a nearby river, the killing of those directly involved in the burial process, or simply the natural anonymity of a vast and largely unmapped landscape, have been the subject of speculation and legend for centuries since. Despite numerous attempts by later explorers, archaeologists, and researchers, the tomb of Genghis Khan has never been definitively located. There is something genuinely striking about this final fact, worth sitting with for a moment. A man who had spent his entire life becoming increasingly visible, increasingly powerful, increasingly impossible for the wider world to ignore, vanished, at the very end, into complete and enduring mystery, his final resting place unknown even to the descendants who would go on to rule the empire he built. But the death of Genghis Khan was not the end of this story, and it would be a mistake to treat it as such, because what happened after his death is, in its own way, just as important to understanding his ultimate historical significance as anything he personally achieved during his lifetime. Ogdi, as had been arranged, succeeded his father as Great Khan, formally confirmed in the position through a Kurultai convened in the traditional manner, echoing the same gathering that had once elevated his father to supreme authority over the unified Mongol tribes decades earlier. Under Ogdi's leadership, and under the leadership of the generations of Mongol rulers who followed him, the empire did not simply consolidate what Genghis Khan had personally conquered. It expanded dramatically further, in directions and to a scale that even Genghis Khan himself, at the height of his own conquests, likely never fully anticipated. Mongol armies completed the conquest of the Jin dynasty in northern China, a war that had begun during Genghis Khan's own lifetime, but would not reach its conclusion until years after his death. Mongol forces pushed deep into Persia and the wider Middle East, and, in one of the most consequential campaigns of the entire empire, swept across the Russian principalities and into Eastern Europe, reaching as far as Hungary and Poland before internal Mongol political considerations, following the death of Ogdi himself, brought that particular western advance to a halt. Later in the century, Genghis Khan's grandson Kublai Khan would complete the conquest of southern China and establish the Yuan dynasty, formally ruling China under a Mongol imperial house. By the time this vast process of expansion finally reached its natural limits, the Mongol Empire had grown into the largest contiguous land empire in recorded human history, stretching at its greatest extent from the Pacific coast of East Asia to the edges of Central Europe. It is important, in reflecting on this achievement, to draw a careful and honest distinction. Genghis Khan did not personally conquer all of this territory. Vast portions of the empire's ultimate expansion occurred after his death, carried out by his sons, grandsons, and the generals and administrators who inherited and continued to operate the political and military system he had originally built. His true and lasting achievement, viewed from this perspective, was not simply the scale of his own personal conquests, considerable as they genuinely were. It was the creation of a system, a structure of loyalty, organization, and military coordination robust enough to continue functioning, and indeed to continue expanding dramatically, even after the singular, extraordinary individual who had built it was gone. That system left behind a legacy that resists any simple, single-word judgment, and it deserves to be examined honestly, in its full and genuine complexity, rather than reduced to either uncritical admiration or uncomplicated condemnation. The human cost of the Mongol conquests, across the whole of Genghis Khan's campaigns and those of his immediate successors, was genuinely enormous. Cities were destroyed. Populations were displaced, killed, or scattered. Agricultural and irrigation infrastructure that had taken generations to build was, in some regions, devastated beyond meaningful recovery within living memory. Entire political and cultural systems that had existed for centuries were violently swept aside within the span of a few remarkable, terrible years. None of this can or should be minimized in service of a more flattering historical narrative, and this documentary has not attempted to do so. And yet, alongside this genuine devastation, the Mongol Empire also produced a period of connectivity and exchange across Eurasia that had few precedents in prior human history. With enormous stretches of the continent now falling under a single, if loosely coordinated, political umbrella, trade routes that had once been fragmented and dangerous became, for a time, considerably safer and more heavily traveled, a period later historians would come to describe as something resembling a Pax Mongolica, a Mongol peace. However incomplete, and however built upon an initial foundation of conquest and destruction. Goods, ideas, technologies, and people moved across distances and between cultures with a frequency that would not be matched again for centuries. Administrative practices, including systems of relay communication, taxation, and census-taking, were refined and spread across enormous territories. Genghis Khan himself, notably, pursued a policy of considerable religious tolerance across his growing empire, generally allowing conquered populations to continue practicing their own faiths, whether Buddhist, Christian, Muslim, or otherwise. A pragmatic approach that stood in real contrast to the frequent religious conflicts that characterized so much of the medieval world beyond Mongol borders during this same period. None of this integration erases or excuses the violence that made it possible. It exists alongside that violence, inseparably, And any honest accounting of Genghis Khan's legacy has to hold both realities simultaneously, without collapsing the complexity into a single, comfortable conclusion in either direction. He was a man capable of extraordinary organizational vision, capable of building a system of loyalty and administration that would outlast him by generations. And he was also a man directly responsible for immense violence and destruction across an enormous portion of the medieval world. Both of these things are true. Neither one cancels out the other. It is worth returning, in these final moments, to where this story actually began, not as a lengthy recap, but as a quiet reminder of the distance traveled. The starving child who once foraged for roots and river fish alongside a mother determined not to let her family perish. The boy abandoned by the very followers who had once depended on his father. The prisoner who wore a wooden collar and escaped only through his own nerve and the mercy of strangers. The young husband whose wife was taken from him, and who learned, in that crisis, that he could not survive alone, that alliances and loyalty would have to become the tools of his survival. The leader betrayed by men he had trusted, reduced at points to drinking from muddy water with only a handful of followers remaining at his side. The man who lost and rebuilt, and lost again, and rebuilt again, until there was nothing left on the steppe capable of standing against him. That same person eventually stood at the center of the largest political and military transformation the Mongolian steppe, and eventually much of the wider world, had ever seen. Not because he personally conquered every mile of the empire that would eventually bear his legacy, but because he built the foundation, the system, the structure of loyalty and organization, upon which his successors would go on to construct the largest contiguous land empire in recorded history. The question this story leaves behind is not the simple one so many people reach for instinctively. Was Genghis Khan good, or was he evil? That question is far too small for the historical reality of what actually happened, and it flattens a genuinely complicated human life into something far more comfortable and far less honest than the truth deserves. The better question, the one worth actually sitting with, is this: how does a boy who begins life with almost nothing, who loses his father, his family's followers, his security, and very nearly his own life more than once before he has even reached adulthood, become a man capable of reshaping the fate of an entire continent? Perhaps the answer lies precisely in what he lost. He had spent his childhood learning, more thoroughly and more painfully than almost anyone in recorded history, exactly how quickly power could disappear, how easily loyalty could evaporate, how completely a life could collapse in the space of a single afternoon. And perhaps that early, brutal lesson is exactly why he spent the rest of his life building something that could not so easily be erased: a system, an empire, a legacy almost impossible for the world to simply ignore or forget. The boy who once fought simply to survive had become the ruler whose name would echo for centuries. And even after he was gone, buried somewhere beneath the vast, unmarked grassland of the world that had made him, the empire he had built kept moving, carried forward by the sons, generals, and systems he had spent his entire extraordinary life constructing, out of nothing, out of loss, out of the sheer, stubborn refusal to disappear.